Well, I sort of work in the areas between heritage,
Mm.
we can talk about what that is, tourism to some extent, but only specific aspects of tourism. And I mean, quite a lot of stuff on place marketing, place imaging, place promotion, place branding.
Mm.
These might appear to be quite different, disparate things, but not to me. I tend to work in the areas between them, and they tend to overlap pretty heavily,
Mm.
in my view.
And when you mention heritage, what does it mean?
It means the contemporary uses of the past.
Mm.
That's very easy to say, difficult to work out. Heritage is the way we now decide to use pasts.
Mm.
Pasts are imaginary creations, of course.
Mm.
Things we now need, or think we need, or think we may well need, for various reasons, which could be economic, or political, or social, or whatever, or in terms of identity.
So the past is, if I get it right, the past is not something set in stone
No.
in there.
No, it's not set in anything. The past is what we choose to create. At least heritage is the way we create from pasts.
Mm.
Historians have a different way of treating pasts, of course.
Mm.
And heritage people know, they are interested in how we now use it.
Mm. And is there anything like a good way of using it, or is there a way of abusing heritage?
There's always good ways and bad ways, effective ways and ineffective ways, and deep ways and trivial ways. But there are very rarely right ways and wrong ways.
Mm-hmm.
Historians have right and wrong in that sense. In heritage, it's the experience that is important. And it can be good or bad or whatever. That's a matter of management.
And in your keynote, you mentioned the something like the traditional, can I call it traditional approach of preservation in there, and the concept of heritage in there, and the different agents that are active in this development. So,
oh right,
something like the museum preserver administrators in there. And what is the role, for example, of the user, or what is the user in this context?
Well, if you're in a preservation paradigm, the important people making the decisions are generally those that are expert on the resources, those that are authenticating, making selections, choosing and choosing not to preserve certain things. These tend to be the top-down experts, the art historians, the museum directors, the conservators, etc., etc. If you go into a conservation paradigm and you start adding uses, then you get planners coming along, because you're dealing with function as well as form in a historic space, city or area. Once you start doing that, then you're into heritage planning, which is much, much wider. And if you're actually in heritage as such, then it's ultimately the end user you're thinking about. And they are determining, in a sense, what the heritage is, how that heritage product is created, which interpretation, etc., etc. And these could be in the economic field. This is a tourism conference. Tourism is a major user. It's not the only economic user of heritage, anything like, but it is a major one. There are political users, of course. Ultimately, it is all political. It can be used for social reasons, social engineering, social manipulation. You want cohesive society, an inclusive society, or whatever sort of society you're trying to create. Therefore, a different set of actors appears on the scene.
And you mentioned the concept of national identity, or identity in the creation of heritage. If I got it right.
Yeah.
And could you say something about that, or is it?
Yeah. Well, we can wander off on that one for a very long time, if you like, but heritage is used to legitimate political entities and ideologies. Again, and that's not in any sense sinister. So even pluralist democracies need to legitimate themselves and their government, or governments. It's often more pluralist. But of course, we know historically what happened in the conservational world, in the world of buildings, monuments, museums, and so on, that the past was effectively nationalized at the end of the 19th century. You get the rise of nationalism as a political ideology, and you get the rise of a concern for heritage, much the same time period, end of the 19th century. That wasn't coincidence. Which one caused which, we could argue about. But certainly if you want to create the concept of nation, one of your principal instruments for doing that is the invention of a heritage, which can justify, legitimate, demarcate this mythical idea, the nation, which we have to create, us, as opposed to them over there, who are outside our heritage. So it was effectively nationalizing. That's not to say we don't have other scales operating now. We do, and they've challenged this national scale, the local, the regional, and the global, of course. People would say, what about world heritage? Well, yes, we have numerous spatial scales now, and they are sometimes complementary. If you think sort of Russian doll model, we could have scale inside scale inside scale, and that's for all of us. I am me, but I also belong to my town, I belong to my region, I belong to my country, I belong to my continent, my world, and I can quite happily, possibly, operate on a multiple scale like that, or it may conflict. The national may conflict with the regional, or the international may conflict with the national. And yes, you don't need me to point out all the case studies where that's actually happening around the world. So it is a thing in constant conflict. But let's not be pessimistic, and I'm not. Most of these are manageable situations. Once you recognize that the potential for disagreement, different interpretation, polysemicity, if you want to use long words like that, different meanings at the same time from the same place, these are generally manageable. But first of all, you have to recognize that they exist. And otherwise you can't manage it.
And if you could give something like an example where something like conflicting, kind of conflicting readings or meanings of certain things are communicated equally, more or less equally in a certain way. Is there something that springs to your mind?
Equally. I suppose one more obviously picks up the conflict situations, because they're often more dramatic.
Or in a conflict?
Yeah, I'm thinking. Well, I did quite a lot of knocking of organizations like English Heritage in that keynote. But I can think of many occasions when they have seen the point and have, for example, the commemoration of the abolition of the slave trade, which was in 2007, wasn't it? Commemoration, the 100-year anniversary. It'll be 100 years. From 1807, it was abolished, 200. Now, they had the problem or the challenge of how are we going to interpret that? And obviously there are different groups with different views. It raises issues of us and them, perpetrators and victims. But on the whole, they did rather well, I thought. How are you going to interpret a place like Bristol or Liverpool, their museums, when you have polyglot populations now, some of whom are associating with the perpetrators, presumably, the traders, some of which will associate with the victims, the slaves, 2 or 3 generations back, but there's different identities there. On the whole, they tried to do it very all-inclusively. I would feel they succeeded, but maybe many think they didn't go far enough in one direction or another. At least they recognized the existence of the problem. And places like English Heritage are really quite good at doing that. And compensating for having made a few sharp remarks about them earlier. But,
And when you think about your career in research and your motivation in there, what is it that drives your research? What fascinates you about your subject? That's a more general question.
Well, I suppose as an academic, I'm an academic. I'm interested in the search for truth. I still believe there is something out there called truth, even though we will never find it, and we'll all have different views of it when we do find it. Yes, of course. So that's the academic hat. But equally, I'm a citizen. I live in a country. I live in a city. I live in a place which has increasing problems of plural societies, or perceived problems. I think these are manageable, but first we have to understand what is going on, and heritage has a major role to play. Not least in my city, in my country, and my continent in Europe here, but outside, yeah, indeed, it's a similar sort of situation. So as a citizen, absolutely. As a person, yes, I meet these things every day. And yes, I do love the Taj Mahal. I get cultural aesthetic satisfaction from it. But that's quite a different matter from taking up the preservationist position and saying that's the only possible value of it, and these values are intrinsic. They're not, they're extrinsic. Someone has taught me how to do that. I don't know who did or what culture did, but it did.
Thank you very much.
Okay.